In this video, I want to step you through the sample literature review that you were asked to read. And the reason I'm doing this is because I think it can be really useful if you look at a sample of what you're being asked to write, and I sort of point out for you the strengths of that sample as well as some areas for improvement. So this sample paper is one that I just found online. It's not one that was prepared for our course. So I'm just going to highlight for you some of the things that this paper I think does really well and some other areas where it could be improved, and some features that you probably want to avoid yourself in your own literature review. So what we're looking at right now is the title page of this literature review, and you were asked to read the sample, so it should be familiar to you, and you can access the PDF in our course site, or if you have a hard copy, look at that. So this is the title page, and this paper is formatted in APA style. So if your discipline uses APA, then you should have a title page. So you'll notice that for this title, the student avoids referring to this paper as a literature review. It's not titled Literature Review: Myths of Violence and the Stigma of Mental Illness. And you really don't need to include literature review in the title of your paper, because as your reader actually starts getting into the content of the paper, it will become clear that that is what this paper is, that it's a literature review. Also, putting literature review in there, it can seem like a strategy that a less sophisticated writer would do. That's pretty typical of writers who haven't quite developed that more sophisticated ability or confidence in their research and writing. They'll tend to title the paper Literature Review or Literature Review : whatever the topic is. So this title is specific to the title that is the focus of or the topic that is the focus of the literature review, which is myths of violence and then the stigma that is related to mental illness. So let's just go to the next page. Also, if you're using APA style, this second page should actually be the abstract page, so that's missing here. So just note that this is a model, but a model paper doesn't mean that you should write your paper or format your paper exactly as that model does, because there could be some errors. And in this case, there's possibility that there was an abstract page and it was just removed for some reason. And so we get onto this page and we have our title centered at the top of the page, and that is a feature of APA. But if you're using APA, again, your second page of the paper would be the abstract page. It'd be the third page where we get here, and on that third page is where we would find the title again. So let's just go through this sentence by sentence. Okay. So to start with the introduction, the mentally ill face a multitude of challenges. That's a really broad context statement. Remember from discussion about how to write an intro before, there are sort of three components. One is typically intros start with broad contextualizing background. So you have this really broad generalized statement, and then you work your way to your specific focus as the intro continues. So that's what we're getting here. So we know the general topic will have something to do with the mentally ill and the challenges that they face, but that's so generalized that if a reader were stopped there, he or she wouldn't know what the actual focus of the paper is. Right, one of those challenges is the stigmatization they face, and so here's where we're starting to segue into the specific focus of the paper. Stigmatization is social rejection, right? And so here we're getting a defining statement. And remember, I think this was in one of your readings before, defining a term in your introduction generally isn't an especially effective strategy to use, especially to open a paper. If you ever do define a term, you want it to be because it's likely the reader will not be familiar with the term, or perhaps there are a multitude of ways of defining that term. So presumably the reason why the author is defining the term here is because because the fake author name assigned to this, I think, is Susie Student, is because she thinks that there are different ways of approaching how we define stigmatization, so she wants to make it really clear what definition she's drawing on. Notice the semicolon. Just as a reminder, a grammar mechanics reminder here for you, you use the semicolon to connect two ideas that are related, so they're somehow connected in terms of subject matter. So related ideas that could each be written as a sentence. So if we were to put a period here, what comes before the semicolon would be a sentence, and what comes after the semicolon would be a sentence. Okay, so that's how you know the semicolon is used correctly. So those stigmatized are rejected by people because of the label they carry, or that their behaviors clearly indicate that they belong to a certain label group. So again, this is just building on this definition here of stigmatization as social rejection. Stigmatization of the mentally ill is caused by the public's beliefs and myths about the dangerousness of the mentally ill, and exposing those myths can reduce stigmatization. So this is our thesis. We know that this should be setting up the specifics of the paper. And there's sort of two components here. We sort of get a problem and then a solution. So the problem is that the mentally ill are stigmatized, and that that stigmatization is caused by how the public views the mentally ill, specifically in terms of their dangerousness. And then here's our solution, is that if we can expose those myths that the public tends to buy into, then we can actually reduce the stigmatization that the mentally ill face. So we're seeing that this intro is a pretty good intro in terms of starting really broadly, and then working into the specific focus, making that focus clear, offering a definition in case the reader may be operating from a different perspective on what stigmatization is, and then getting into what the problem is and the significance of that problem and the solution to that problem. So it's a really good introduction in terms of targeting those different features and setting up the paper really well for the reader. So when we have these two parts here, we know that we're going to anticipate discussion of that stigmatization and public's beliefs, and then it's probably later in the paper that we're going to get into this solution, this idea of exposing the myth. Okay. So our first body paragraph, regarding the mentally ill, it appears that people respond to the mentally ill with feelings of fear and rejection. And notice that this topic sentence, and remember the first sentence of a paragraph, of a body paragraph, is the topic sentence. Notice that this topic sentence is not specific to one source, okay? So what's good about this, and especially for a literature review where you're supposed to synthesize multiple sources, what's good about this kind of a topic sentence is that it enables you to talk about more than one source in the paragraph. Because if the topic sentence has started with this, then, especially depending on how it was written, that may limit the body paragraph to only that one source. And when you're writing a literature review and you're synthesizing multiple sources, you want to be able to, as much as possible, integrate at least a couple of sources in each body paragraph. Now, you may have a paragraph or two where you only discuss one source, but those paragraphs are really rare within a literature review, because a literature review's goal is to tell the reader, okay, this is what we know and what we don't know from the research. All right, it's to inform the reader of the current state of the research. And it's very difficult for you to write an informative paper about the state of the research if what you're doing is sort of saying, all right, this source tells me this, this source tells me this, this source tells me this, because then the reader has to go and identify those patterns. Your reader has to remember the content of one body paragraph as he or she moves to the next body paragraph and then to the next paragraph. And your reader shouldn't have to do all that work. You should be the one pointing out the patterns. So you want these kinds of topic sentences that identify a theme, so to speak, a major topic that carries across more than one source. Okay, and also remember that whatever your topic sentence is, it has to match the content of the entire paragraph. Okay, so it's really important that whatever content goes in your body paragraph is directly related to this topic sentence, because if you have any kind of transition away from this topic sentence and the content of the body paragraph, you either need to go in and revise your topic sentence, or you need to reorganize your paragraph so that wherever you transition in thought, you split that content into a new paragraph. Okay. Martin, Pesca, Solito, and Touche examined the effects of descriptions of the target's behavior, causal attributions about the source of the behavior, the target's perceived dangerousness, labeling, and participants' socio-demographic characteristics. So here we're getting the introduction of the first source in the paper, and it's from 2000. Notice it's a multi-authored. This actually should be the word and, not the ampersand. The ampersand gets used in the bibliographic citation, as well as the parenthetical. Sorry. Yeah, but not in the actual text itself. But anyway, so one thing about this is that I don't think this is introduced in a way that's really cohesive. I think it would be useful if maybe instead of saying it appears, it could say, regarding the mentally ill, research shows that people respond, and that gives a little bit of a better transition, or else kind of adjusting how this starts here. The other thing that is problematic about this sentence to me is that what are targets? Okay. Really, your reader needs a little bit more context here, or else needs some different language here to really better understand what this research is referring to, because otherwise, all of a sudden we're introduced to this terminology of targets, behavior, causal attributions, etc., and the reader is just sort of thrown into that without really having much of a build-up. So that's the issue that I have here with how this is presented. 20% of the participants labeled a target described with depressed symptoms as having a mental illness, as compared with 54% for those described with schizophrenic symptoms, or 1% with normal troubles. 37% would be unwilling to interact with a depressed person, 48% for the schizophrenic, and 21% for normal troubles. And 33% felt that the depressed person would do violence to others, 61% for the schizophrenic, and 17% for the normal troubles. So here we're getting specific findings from this study. And one thing I think is really important is that when you're getting percentages like this, when you're getting findings, you really need to have an understanding of the study that's producing those findings. So we don't really know at this point how this study was done. We have no clue how many participants there were. So if there were only 5 participants, knowing 24 or 20% of them labeled a target described depressed symptoms, that's not a big number, okay? So a critical reader is going to look at this and think, well, you're supposed to be informing me of the current state of the research, but I don't really understand this study. I don't know how many participants were involved. I don't know how the study was actually conducted. So you want to be really careful in your literature review whenever you're reporting on this research that you are giving enough information for the reader to understand that research that you're synthesizing, okay? Thus, a common respond, and this should be response, to the mentally ill are, and that should be is, rejection and fear of violence, or this should be responses, and then leave the are. I think that, especially for this claim, if we're saying it's a common response, we really need to have more than just the one study that's cited here, right? We're going to look for more information than that. And so hopefully we get that in the next paragraph. While based upon research, the common response to a mentally ill person is to fear violence, diagnosed mental patients commit violence at the same rates as non-diagnosed people. So we don't get here any more research that supports this claim, but what the author is trying to do here is she's segueing into this idea that this is a myth, right? So she's starting to link this research and what it's showing us about public perceptions. She's linking that into the fact that that is faulty perception because, according to this study, Martin et al., we know that diagnosed mental patients commit violence at the same rates as non-diagnosed people. Now, as a critical reader, one question that I would have would be, is this all form of violence, okay? Or is it only certain forms of violence? Because to me, that's really important to note, because this seems like a fairly broad sentence or a broad statement to claim that violence is committed at the same rates between these two groups. And you know, the idea would be that the reader's going to look at that and think, oh, okay, well, violence in general at the same rates. But that may or may not be the case. So I think it would be really useful if we got some more information from this study. And you'll notice this is a really short paragraph, too. I mean, visually it stands out to you because it's only 2 sentences long, which doesn't mean that a 2-sentence paragraph is a bad paragraph, but I think you really need to keep in mind how much content do you need to provide for the reader to understand that research without you overwhelming the reader. Public perceptions may not match reality due to the public's lack of contact with the mentally ill. So here what we're doing is she's using this statement as a transition into this next paragraph, as you'll see in a minute. And this, of course, links into this because it's about perceptions versus reality, right? So we do have that common link. But again, I think this paragraph really needs more content between this first sentence and this last sentence. All right, Alexander and Link. So notice this topic sentence focuses specifically on this source, so the reader's going to anticipate only discussion of Alexander and Link. Examine contact with the mentally ill and the stigma of mental illness, perceptions of dangerousness and social distance, and a telephone survey. Okay, so this is linking into, of course, this sentence that I told you was being used as a transition sentence. And we'll see that because this is all going to be about contact. So what's good here is that we do know it was a telephone survey, and we know specifically what was being looked at. All right, they found that as the participants' own life contact with mentally ill individuals increased, participants were both less likely to perceive a target mentally ill individual in a vignette, and a vignette is just a story, as physically dangerous and less likely to desire social distance from the target. So here we're getting this idea that, according to this Alexander and Link study, if a participant in that study had contact with a mentally ill person, then he or she was less likely to believe that that mentally ill individual would be dangerous, and also less likely to try to avoid the mentally ill individual. So again, this is tying into this idea of public perception versus reality, and also starting to segue a little bit into the solution, because if we can break down that myth, then we can start to reduce, if not eliminate, stigmatization. This relationship remained after controlling for demographic and confound variables such as gender, ethnicity, education, income, and political conservatism. They also found that any type of contact with a friend, a spouse, a family member, or work contact, or a contact in a public place with mentally ill individuals reduced perceptions of dangerousness of the target of the vignette. These two sentences are really important for establishing validity of the study, and you would want to make sure you included something like this if all these variables were accounted for. Okay, and I'll pick this back up with the next video.